So I'd like to thank you for joining me on this somewhat snowy St. John Day for a little walk down Elliot Row from the warmth and comfort of the great indoors. So this program was made possible with a grant from the St. John Community Arts Board, which we received in June 2020. So as you can see, I'm not the fastest writer in the world, but better late than never. And so on Elliot Row, the families that we will visit with today are the Boyanners, the Jacobsons, the Goldfeathers, and the Gus family. So it's a little shorter of a walk than some that we've done. And in case anybody was ever wondering how they come up with the street names in St. John, Elliot Row was named in honor of Sir George Augustus Elliot, who later became Lord Heathfield. And this fellow fought in the 7 Years' War and defended the island of Gibraltar from attacks by the French and Spanish, and ended up as the governor of Gibraltar from 1783 until 1790 when he died. So I'm not quite sure what his connection was to St. John, but I guess when they were naming the streets, he was one of the ones that came up. So we'll get right into the walk and our first stop, and I'm sure this building looks much different than it did when it was the home of the Boyanner family. Kate Boyanner and her children, Louis, Harry, Eli, Bertie, and Francis. But I'm just going to back up a little bit just so we don't leave out the patriarch of the family. This one, okay. Just want to make sure we're recording. It's occurred to me that, oh no, we're good. Okay. So Don Boyanner, who was born in 1860 in Poland and died in St. John in 1910, did not actually live in the Elliot Row building. At that time, the family was living on High Street, which was a street that ran off of Main Street in the Old North End. And of course, High Street is one of the streets that vanished in urban renewal in the 1960s. So he did come to St. John before the end of the 19th century, and he left Russia to escape the pogroms, as so many did. And he established an optometry business on Dock Street in 1894. And his optometry business was carried on by his sons, as I'll get to. And he died suddenly on October the 23rd, 1910. So taken a bit early, I guess, but we didn't want to leave him out. And you can see a couple of early advertisements for the optometry shop, and which by the time of these ads in 1919 and a little bit after, it was at 111 Charlotte Street, so just around the corner from the head of King Street. The building is still standing, in case anybody's wondering. I'm not quite sure what's in the building now. I can't remember. So we'll move on to Kate Poyas Boyanner. And the Poyas family had also come to St. John, and they came from Warsaw, Poland in the 1890s. Her sister, Esther Goldfeather, lived just down the street, so we'll get to her shortly. And there was also another brother, Abraham Poyas, who I think ended up in New York. So as I mentioned, the Boyanner family had 4 sons, Louis, Eli, Harry, and Frank, and there were 2 daughters, Frances and Bertie. And Kate Boyanner was one of the founding members of the Daughters of Israel, and this was an organization established in 1899, and its mission was to help the needy in the community and the sick. So they raised funds for the immigrant families. They also raised funds to build the first mikveh, which would have been in the basement of the old Ahavath Ahim, or the old Talmud Torah building. And Mrs. Boyanner was also a member of the hospital aid. And this is a photograph of her that was taken in Pamdenak, one of hundreds, I think, photographs I have from Dan Ellman that were taken in Pamdenak. So we'll tackle the children in what I hope is the right order. So we'll start with Louis Boyaner. And he worked with his father and his brother Eli, and he was the manager of Boyaner Brothers Opticians. So the office did start originally at 38 Dock Street, and then, as you saw in the ads, moved up to 111 Charlotte Street. And Louis Boyaner was a world traveler, and some of his visits included trips to Hollywood to visit his friend Jerry Mayer, the brother of the much more famous Louis B. Mayer. And he also traveled to Egypt. So somewhere in the collection, I have a picture of Mr. Boyaner perched on top of a camel. Louis Boyaner was also an accomplished musician, and he played the violin at the St. John Opera House and as part of the Young Judeo Orchestra, along with most of his siblings. He was a charter member of the St. John Society of Music, which was established in November 1919. And there was a large contingent of St. John residents involved with that organization. He was also involved in many other things in the community, including as a charter member of the St. John Kiwanis Club. He was an honorary member of Lodge number 22 of the Masons, and as well as a life member of the Knights of Pythias. And one of the things I thought was really interesting, one of his interesting stories is that he sailed on board the original Blue Nose. So the same ship that's on all of our dimes, and I guess today they may still have tours of the Blue Nose too. I'm not sure. And he died in 1973. He never did marry. So the next brother is Harry Israel Boyaner, and he was born in Montreal and then died in Vancouver. He was also an optician. So he did start out his career in the family business on Dock and Charlotte Streets and lived at Elliot Row. During the First World War, he enlisted in the Royal Flying Corps, enlisted in Montreal in February of 1918, and remained in uniform until the end of 1918 because he had only signed on for the duration of the war, and he served as a cadet pilot. After the war, he moved to the West Coast, to Vancouver, where he was the Western manager of the Imperial Optical Company and the Prescription Optical Company. He married Charlotte Bitterman, and he has two daughters, Susan and Carol. So hopefully Carol was able to join us today. And this is a picture of him in his World War I uniform. Eli Boyaner is probably the most famous member of the family. So he was born in St. John in 1893, and one of the first children born to Eastern European parents in St. John. And he became the city's one of the leading optometrists in the city, having followed in his father's footsteps. He was also a founder of the New Brunswick Optometrical Society, and he was also that organization's president in 1929. In 1950, he became the president of the Maritime Optometrical Association and was the first person to receive an honorary doctorate of optometry from the College of Optometry in Ontario. But as prominent as he was among the opticians in the city, he was even more widely known as a leader in the Boy Scout movement for more than 43 years. He started with the Judean Boy Scout groups, and then moved up through the ranks as district commissioner, and then assistant provincial commissioner, then provincial commissioner, and finally president of the New Brunswick Provincial Council. He was also the second Canadian named to the International Scouting Committee, and he was a camp chief at provincial, national, and international Scout jamborees, which enabled him to travel across Canada and around the world. And one of the places he went to was India, where he had an interview with Prime Minister Nehru. No idea if he managed to secure a Nehru jacket as a souvenir, but he also started in 1931 the first Boy Scout Apple Day. And this is a fundraising endeavor that continued at least up until COVID, and maybe it's going to make a comeback. And the apples for those original Apple Days were stored in a shed behind the house on Elliot Row. So Dr. Boyaner was also active in the YMHA and was its president in 1930. He was also president of the congregation for 8 years from 1932 to 1941. And in 1959, he wrote a history of the early Jewish community, which was published in the collections of the New Brunswick Historical Society. And as if that wasn't enough, he was one of the founding members of the St. John Rotary Club, which was established in 1914. And in 1955, this organization was instrumental in creating the Boys and Girls Club. And it's still in the same location today. He liked being president because he was also president of the St. John branch of the Canadian Red Cross Society in 1944 and 1945, so during the Second World War, and was named to the Provincial Council in 1944, and then president of the New Brunswick Red Cross in 1957. Let's see, so he married Esther Blitz on the 2nd of June, 1926, and so she came to St. John to be with him, and here she is. And so she was involved with the Red Cross and with the Rotary as well. So was the first president of the Rotary Anns, so the female side of the Rotary Club. She was president of the St. John Hospital Aid from 1950 to 1956, the first Jewish woman in the community to hold that role, but not the last. And they had 2 children, Dawn and Shirley. And the interesting story about Esther Blitz, particularly in the years leading up to the Second World War, is that the family were gathering around the radio and listening to broadcasts coming from Europe. She could translate the German broadcasts for the family. So they had full realization of the dreadful things that were coming to pass in Germany and through Europe. And her involvement with the Rotary Anns and with the Red Cross, they were doing things like collecting clothing and bedding for disaster relief programs and dressings for the blood transfusion services. The hospital aid, amongst their tasks, were collecting books for the nurses' library at the General Hospital, purchasing and distributing treats and gifts to the hospital patients. So perhaps going down the street to the Sunray fruit store and getting fruit baskets to bring up to the patients. And they also provided prizes for the student nurses during their training. And they were really focusing on charitable efforts for the patients rather than just the material needs of the hospitals, as many of the other hospital aid organizations were doing. Just a couple of notes on the children. So Dawn Boyaner also became an optometrist and practiced in Montreal. And their daughter, Shirley, studied nursing at the Beth Israel Hospital in New York and married Herbie Lipschitz of Fredericton in 1954. So the next child that appeared to the family was Frances, or Fanny Boyaner Smith. And she worked briefly as a clerk for the Board of Pensions, and then really just became a housewife, I guess, and assisted her husband. She married Norman Smith on the 15th of February in 1927, and they lived briefly in Annapolis Royal, Nova Scotia, where Norman was the manager of the King's Theatre. So like many of the people in the Jewish community involved in the theater business, film distribution, theater management. He left that position in 1941 when he enlisted in the Royal Canadian Air Force, and he was a clerk for the Air Force from 1941 to 1944. After he was discharged and back in St. John, he opened Norman's Tobacco on King Street sometime before 1950, and the store operated until 1970, at which point they would have retired. So Frank Boyaner must have been the rebel in the family because he became a dentist rather than an optometrist. And his practice was initially at 22 Germain Street in the 1920s. And then he moved around the corner to 63 King Street and had his office there until the Second World War. He had joined the non-permanent active militia well before the declaration of war in 1939 and was already a lieutenant in the Canadian Army Dental Corps by September 1939. He was the district dental officer for Military District Number 7, which included St. John, and as well was the dental officer for the 14th Field Ambulance, also headquartered in St. John, and which also included Dr. Joseph Tansman, who I think headed up that particular group. By 1941, he was posted overseas in England with the 1st Canadian Fighter Squadron and was posted at various training bases, and then was with the Dental Corps through Malta, up through the campaign in Sicily, and spent a year with the Army in Italy. And throughout the war, he was sending postcards back to his nephew in St. John, his nephew Dan Ellman. And the postcards focused on topics of interest to a young boy, maybe 10 years old. A lot of stories about airplanes. And one photograph that we have that you may see in our next walk is that Dr. Boyaner was part of an honor guard that was sent out to as a reception for King George VI. And the photo includes a fly past in an airplane by a Polish officer flying a Hurricane aircraft. Sadly, Dr. Boyaner was the only one of the Jewish war veterans from St. John who perished overseas, not from battle, but from illness on the 9th of January, 1945, just a month or two before he was expected to return home to St. John. He is buried in the Brookwood Military Cemetery in Surrey, England. And he did have a war bride, Hazel Morris, and she came to St. John after the war had ended and stayed in St. John with the family for about a year. And we have in the museum's collection the memorial cross that she received from the Army as his widow. And she left this behind with the family before she left. So we'll have a little bit more about him in our next walk. And we'll move on to Bertie Boyaner Ellman. She was born in 1900. So she was involved with the Sisterhood and with Hadassah. She was also an active bridge player and involved in a lot of theatricals in the community in her earlier days. She was also a Girl Guide leader, and she led the Young Judean gymnastics team. She married Maury Ellman in 1929, and we have a picture of the wedding, lots of bridesmaids, and they had 2 children, Dan and Eleanor is with us today. And we'll talk a bit about the children in that family in a page or two. I'm just going to pause briefly and talk about Morris Ellman as well, since Bertie and Maury Ellman did live in that Elliot Street home for a period of time. And Maury Ellman was also a member of the Canadian Dental Corps. He had trained as a dental technician at Bodie University in New York, but came back from that and was working in St. John as a film distributor for Warner Brothers and as a partner in the family shoe repair business on Main Street. And after the war, he continued in film distribution and owned maritime film transport. So he enlisted in October of 1939. And even after the war ended, he maintained his membership in the reserves until the 1960s. So as we knew him at that time, Captain Ellman was posted to in St. John, in Brockville, Winnipeg, and Halifax, and then was sent overseas where he was attached to the Royal Canadian Air Force for 1944 and 1945. And he trained at the Canadian School of Army Administration in Winnipeg before going overseas. So we'll talk a little bit more about him in the next walk as well. So Dan Ellman is an important part of the St. John Jewish community, well liked and well loved by everybody, and has been involved in probably almost everything. He was involved in the Judean Scouts, he was in Young Judea, he was in YMAJ, and was a leader in the congregation. Has had a lot of university experience, starting with the University of New Brunswick, and then on to Dalhousie, and then on to the University of Fribourg in Switzerland, and the Catholic University at Louvain, where he studied medicine. And he did complete his medical studies in 1962 and then went on to the Jungian Institute in Zurich, Switzerland. He has some great stories to tell about his year in Labrador, where he was working with the American Corps of Engineers. And then he was involved with his father with film distribution, with maritime film transport, and then changed careers, became an information technology instructor and consultant for advanced training and services and for J.D. Irving Limited. In the congregation, he was the president in 1983 and 1984. And in that role was one of the people to help organize the Kumahaim that brought everybody back to St. John. And he also served as the community's lay reader for nearly 2 decades after the rabbis had left. So he was leading the Sabbath services, he was teaching the children for their bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs, and did a lot of community outreach, speaking to groups across the city about Judaism, so church groups, school children. He also got involved with the immigration committee that has brought new Israeli families to St. John since about 2008. Dan's also well noted as a champion chess player. He was the 6-time winner of the J.M. Franklin Trophy. And he also honed his chess skills while he was away as a student in Belgium. And he brought back some new ideas when he came back to St. John in 1962 and was involved with the St. John Chess Club and really brought that chess experience to the world-class level by helping to organize the World Chess Festival, which took place in St. John in January and February of 1988. And people involved in the chess community are still talking about that event, which did bring hundreds of world-class chess players from all over the world to St. John. And he followed this up by opening the Chess Center in Brunswick Square, where players could drop in for a game or participate in tournaments. And the other legacy of the festival was the development of school chess programs. And up until the last couple of years, Dan was also giving lessons in the schools to children learning chess. He's done a lot of his own study on Jewish culture, Jewish history, and Jewish ideas. A couple of years ago, he was still giving lectures on some of this material. And he's also written a novel and a book of poetry and at least one book about chess. And he married Anne, and they have 2 children who are both living in St. John, Kate and David. And Eleanor, this is from an exhibit we did a few years ago, but I have a couple of quotes about what life was like living on Elliot Row. And one of the things she said was, our neighbors were the good friends my brother and I played with daily. Down the street, there was my grandmother's sister and her husband, and around the corner were the Friedmans, Lamperts, and Ma Smith. Living in our home were my mother, father, brother Dan, and me, along with my grandmother and uncles. On the top floors are my aunt and uncle and 2 cousins in one apartment, and another aunt and uncle in another apartment. Music in the house constantly, our beloved dogs always with us. I remember roller skating, rope skipping, and hopscotch playing after school. Great memories of playing Shakespeare in our living room. People in our house all the time. Loving family and good friends and music. Of course, June, July, and August in Pamdenak. Our friends were from the Jewish community and non-Jewish community. Active in Young Judea and in the YWCA. Dances at the various clubs every Friday and Saturday night. Hanging out at the Riviera restaurant on Charlotte Street. The shows the Jewish community would have for the servicemen. Rich Bernstein would be the director. And then she says, I, around age 10, sang The White Cliffs of Dover and Yours. She also shared a couple of memories that were fairly specific. One of them, during one Seder, when it came time to open the door for Elijah, I ran to the front door and there stood Mr. Pappas. And I yelled, it's not Elijah, it's Mr. Pappas. And he was one of the regular poker or gym players who came to the family home. On Christmas Day, one of my friends felt I should have a Christmas tree, so she came in with a tiny bush. My grandmother's sister walked in past the living room and on seeing the tree, put her hands to her mouth and said, "Oy vey, what is this?" But with more of a Yiddish accent, which I don't do very well. Eleanor went on to train in nursing at the St. John General Hospital. She married Maury Givner in November 1962, and they went first to Montreal and then back to Halifax. And while in Montreal, she was the head surgical nurse at the Jewish General Hospital. And in 1986, she was in charge of the patient representative program at the Victoria General. So, and they have 2 children, Elliot and Julie. I think that's all of the Boyanners. Yes. So we'll move across the street and down a little bit to 78 Elliot Row. And this was the home for Meyer and Jenny Jacobson from the mid-1950s to the mid-1970s. They had actually lived prior to this down at 144 Elliot Row in the 1940s, and we'll go to that house as the last stop on the walk. So, Meyer Jacobson was in business with his father, Harry Jacobson, on Main Street, where they ran Jacobson and Company, which sold furniture and appliances. So the business had been established in the 1960s and operated until the 1960s, and then I guess had to make way for the urban renewal that completely transformed Main Street. He married Jenny Bloom, and they had 1 daughter, Gloria, who now lives in Halifax. There were a couple of advertisements from the Jacobson store, stoves, furniture, and the Jacobson business seemed to have some ties. No, I'm mixing that up. I always get a couple of people in the community mixed up, so forget I even tried to say that. So Jenny Bloom Jacobson was the daughter of Laser and Haya Bloom, who lived off of Main Street, I think on Simon Street. And Jenny had 2 brothers, Joseph and Bernie. And then her sisters were Mary, Rosie, Sarah, and Betty. And so she was involved with Hadassah, with Sisterhood, and with the Westfield Golf Club. And when we did an exhibit a few years ago about the families, Gloria Jacobson Pink shared her memories of family life on Elliot Row. And she wrote, "We lived at 144 Elliot Row until I was about 6. This had a few apartments and may have been owned by one of the Gusses. I think the gargoyles that were on the front entrance are in the New Brunswick Museum. And that one I'm not sure, I'll have to check into. I know the Abe Gus and Jack Gus families lived there, and I think Mamie and Louis Jacobson, the Perchnocks, and I don't remember who else, as I was very young. We then moved to 78 Elliot Row, where I lived during my school days. I don't remember any Jewish kids being adjacent, but Naomi and Ben Friedman lived next door on Pitt Street, and also the Lampert family. The Holtzman and Pikowski families lived on King Street East, the Gusses on Princess Street, and the Isaacs, Gus, Cohen, and Lieberman families on Orange Street. The Green family lived on Duke Street, and the Goldsteins on Leinster Street. We all walked to school, Victoria School, Princess Anne, Prince Charles, and St. John High School, and then walked to Hebrew School after school. No carpools. And then there was the Riviera restaurant on Charlotte Street for chips and gravy and Cokes. I think I always look back and remember our mothers playing mahjong and hearing the tiles clacking. Did I ever think I would be playing the same game? As kids, being involved in Young Judea and Camp Kadima, always having friends stay at our house for conventions or after camp. And then there was Pamdenak. St. John was the city of choice for all of our friends. After camp, it was St. John that the kids wanted to go to, not Halifax. The women who are such fantastic cooks. Most of these things have carried on to the next generation, even though many are far away. And then she finished out by saying that St. John will always be home. And Gloria is married to Stephen Pink. They have 2 children. I think I counted that right, Michael and Cindy. And they're now living in Halifax, although I'm like, I think most of the rest of us on the call today is enjoying some warmer weather in Florida. So we'll zigzag back across the street and we'll stop at 89 Elliot Row, which is the home of the Goldfeather family. So Samuel and Esther and their children, Louis, Rose, Clara, Faye, and Bernard. And this home stayed with the Goldfeather family until the 1960s. So even after the parents died, Bernard continued to live here for a period of time. So Samuel Goldfeather was the son of Isaac and Hinda Goldfeather. He was born in Poland and came to St. John as a young man and lived in St. John for more than 50 years. He was trained as an optometrist and was the founder of S. Goldfeather and Son, which had offices on Mill Street and then on King Square North. He was one of the charter members of the Sharezetic Synagogue, was a member of the Habanim Lodge, and this was a lodge that focused on Zionist activities. Samuel Goldfeather married Esther Poyas in 1898, and she was, of course, the sister of Kate Boyaner, who lived up the street at number 53. Erminie Cullen, who would have been their granddaughter, shared some information about her grandparents, and she wrote, Esther and Samuel Goldfeather immigrated to North America at the beginning of the 20th century. They brought with them Esther's mother, Etta Poyas, who had been the postmistress in their hometown of Kov, situated on the border of Poland and the Ukraine. The family lived for a short time in Camden, New Jersey, then moved to Chipman, New Brunswick, with a third move to St. John, where Esther's sister Kate and her husband Don Boyaner lived with their family. The Goldfeathers lived first on Prince William Street, then moved up to Wellington Row, and finally over to Elliot Row, where they lived most of their lives in St. John. Samuel practiced optometry and served small communities in southern New Brunswick and Grand Manan, traveling to these places by horse and buggy. He was well-liked and very respected, cutting a dashing figure with his erect posture and precise grooming. Samuel took great pride in his public profile. In later years, he opened an office of optometry on Dock Street and was there until urban renewal, when he moved his office to the Paramount Theater building, an office that his son Bernard would later occupy when he too became an optometrist. Move the page for one moment and you can see Dr. Samuel Goldfeather with his horse and wagon, and also an advertisement from 1919. And he did marry Esther Goldfeather in 1898. So Esther's life was dedicated to her family and her religion. She had a wonderful sense of humor that combined with her love to laugh, and which proved to be her saving grace during the difficult times. She was adept with her hands, and she crocheted tablecloths and doilies for all of her children. Esther taught herself to read and write English, writing her letters to her family in phonetic English. In the summer, the family would travel by streetcar to St. Rest's Beach for a day in the sun and water. Short vacations in the summer were spent in a rented cottage in either Renforth or Bloomfield. In her earlier years, Esther would offer room and board to a few young men who were looking for a kosher home, and these included many recent immigrants to St. John, including Max Brim and Abe Goldberg, who were tailors, Carl and Max Basson, Jacob Margolian, and many of the boarders who stayed in her home slept on the floor using only their coats as blankets, and her home was a place to rest before continuing their journey. So I mentioned ones who stayed in St. John, but there were many others. And later, by saving her pennies from having this boarding house, Esther was able to purchase a Sefer Torah that she donated to the synagogue in memory of her firstborn son, Louis. And this Torah is still in the Ark today with her name embroidered on the bottom of the Torah cover. So the Goldfeathers, Esther Goldfeather died in 1952 and Samuel Goldfeather in 1954. So Louis Goldfeather was only 18 years old when he died from an illness following an operation in 1918. At the time, the family was still living on Prince William Street, so he didn't quite make it out to Elliot Row. The death certificate that I found at the Provincial Archives said he had been ill for about a month. And so I have a picture here of the Torah scroll, and a great-granddaughter of the family Lanny Yampol Gershon donated this Torah cover a few years ago. Was going to come between winter weather and COVID, hasn't been back to St. John to actually see it in place. The next child in the family was Clara Goldfeather Bernstein, and she was married to Mitchell Bernstein. So they had two children, Erminy and Mortimer. She was a member of the Women's Hospital Aid, the Daughters of Israel, Hadassah, and Sisterhood. And we talked a lot more about the Bernstein family when we did the Orange Street Walk. So if you weren't here for that one, I guess you'll have to wait for the recording to learn a little bit more. And this picture was taken, I think, in front of Stone Church, and she's wearing a First World War military uniform that belonged to her brother-in-law. And I thought it was kind of a neat picture. Next child in the family was Faye Goldfeather Yampol, and she married Rabbi Samuel Burr Yampol in 1923. And Rabbi Yampol was actually the rabbi for the St. John congregation at the time. The family later moved to Chicago, Illinois, where they raised their family. And Rose married Hyman Kornblatt in 1943. And she and her husband both worked as insurance adjusters and made their married home on Dufferin Row. And they had no children. And she's pictured here at the left of the image with her mother and with her brother, Bernard. And Bernie Goldfeather, continuing that tradition of being an optometrist. He studied at Vanderbilt University, which was a prestigious private university in Nashville, Tennessee. He had his practice for more than 30 years, and his office was in the Paramount Theater building on King Square. He married Fritzie Cohen, who was from Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, and they had two children, Lauren and Elaine. And the last stop on our walk is 144 Elliot Row, which is all the way at the bottom of the street, so on the other side of Cran Street, so verging on the water. When I do this as an in-person walking tour, we don't walk as far as that house because crossing Cran Street's a little bit tricky. But this is a 3-story apartment building. So the Jacobsons that were living at 78 lived here for a while. There were Gus families living here, and including the Jack Gus family, who later moved across the harbor to Lancaster in 1960. So I'm going to focus on the Gus family, although I know that other families lived in this building as well. So Jack Gus enlisted in the Royal Canadian Army Medical Corps in September 1939 and served until May of 1944. He trained at Camp Sussex and was sent overseas on August the 1st, 1941. He was posted in England, where he worked as an ambulance driver, so picking up those who were wounded in the bombings of London. And he also performed guard duty, operated the petrol or gas pumps, and worked as a clerk in the petrol office. It was a very stressful job and a stressful time, as we can all imagine. And he did have a nervous breakdown as a result of his experiences. His main claim to fame within the Canadian Army, he had the largest feet of anyone, a size 15. So I can just imagine the challenge of finding suitable footwear and keeping with the Army regulations. He kept a scrapbook during the war, recounted some of his experiences, and he continued that scrapbook after he came home. It included information about trips to Israel and his own business. When he returned to St. John after the war, he worked with one of his brothers in the scrap metal business and then established his own company, Jack Gus and Company, which was located on Gilbert's Lane. He was also very involved in the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada, and in the 1950s was instrumental in arranging a visit by then Prime Minister John Diefenbaker to St. John. And family lore tells us that when Jack was in the kitchen of the Admiral Beatty Hotel preparing the Prime Minister's breakfast, and Jack Gus was also instrumental in securing pensions for the war veterans some 50 years after the war, and was part of the first Canadian trade delegation to go to Israel. His wife, Jean, was born in Lithuania and immigrated to Canada at the age of 7. And the Takiv family settled in Moncton in the early 1920s. So she had her father, Benjamin, a sister, Helen, and her brothers, Frank and Max. She married Jack Gus on March the 2nd, 1941. And they had 2 daughters, Phyllis and Monica. In the 1960s, she owned and operated her own beauty salon, the Bon Ton Beauty Salon on Main Street West. And she was a very creative individual. Although she enjoyed knitting, she was also an avid crocheter and made several beautiful garments and items. She delighted her family with wonderful creative cooking and the traditional dishes for the Jewish holidays. She even won the Rabbi's contest for decorating for Hanukkah in St. John in the late 1960s. And as I mentioned, there were 2 children. The photograph on this slide shows Monica and Phyllis Gus with Prime Minister Diefenbaker. Since he's holding pen and paper, I'm assuming they've gotten an autograph. Phyllis Gus, the older of the 2 sisters, attended St. John High School. And when the family moved to Montreal in 1964, she went to Sir George Williams University, which is now Concordia University. She had a brief career as a model and was an unpublished poet and made her life in Montreal. The younger sister, Monica Gus, studied acting at Sir George Williams University, or Concordia, and went on to theater arts at York University, and she now lives in Hollywood, California. Her career on the stage began with ballet recitals and a ballet performance on the iconic Time for Juniors program at the age of 7. And Monica recalled, quote, Sheila Urquhart, the ballet teacher, chose me to perform a ballet solo on CHSJ TV, Time for Juniors. I was 7. When asked, I informed the hostess, Jeannie, that yes, I was from out of town, Lancaster. I did not know why she laughed at me, since Lancaster was 4 miles away across the bridge. And still very much a town of its own. Monica spent several months in Israel and recalled while there, quote, while at school in Jerusalem, I was in the drama group. We put on an English production of Spoon River Anthology. I performed mime and comedy sketches with some of my fellow Judeans and St. Johners while living on a communal kibbutz settlement for several months. I had the opportunity to have modern dance instruction in preparation for a group performance for the Israeli Independence Day Festival. It was a truly exciting honor to be coached by choreographer Ahud Ben David of the Bat Shiva Dancers of Tel Aviv. It was the closest I came to a dream goal I had about doing theater in Israel. A mime troupe on the kibbutz wanted me to remain in Israel and tour with them. I felt the need to return to Canada to continue my education. So if we all have keen television eyes, you may have seen her in some of these television shows. Mad About You, Seeing Things, which was a CBC production, SCTV. She also had film roles in The Visit, Unfinished Business, Women's Lib, Joni, and she's been on the stage in plays including Midnight Zone, Arthur Miller's Celebration, Women Behind Bars, and No No Nanette. She co-founded a theater company in Toronto called Open Door Productions, which ran for about 5 years, and they did their performances in a nearby synagogue. She also participated in workshops at the famous Second City Theater and with John Candy. And she's still a member of the Screen Actors Guild and the Association of Canadian Television and Radio Arts and Canadian Actors Equity. And again, from a previous exhibit, she shared some of her memories of growing up in St. John. Jack and Jean Gus lived in an apartment at the foot of Elliot Row with the Michelsons as upstairs neighbors, and then moved to 30 Coburg Street. In 1957, the Gus family moved to 394 Argyle Street in Lancaster before moving to Montreal in 1964. Jack Gus was the owner of Jack Gus Structural Steel with Ben Friedman as his partner, and Jean Gus operated the Bon Ton Beauty Salon on Main Street West. They had 2 daughters, Phyllis and Monica. Monica received 8 years of her schooling in St. John. She remembers, I was able to walk to school for grades 1 and 2 from Coburg Street. Down the street from us was Woolworth's, a pastry store, wonderful chocolate cupcakes, the city market, which I loved. I loved smelling the dulse and the seafood and flowers. It was so convenient to walk to the shul, and I was able to attend the Saturday services. I missed that when we moved to Lancaster. I attended Hebrew school 3 days a week after regular school, and it seemed to take so long to drive home to Lancaster during rush hour. I was always so hungry. I loved going to Young Judeans on Sunday afternoons. I was voted group president probably too many times. I have wonderful memories of Janice Satzman, Janice Gus, and Miriam Green leading the younger groups. She also recalled her father's political interests. My father was very involved with the conservative political party, even as a young man. He started with the Young Conservatives and handled PR. He was later instrumental in bringing Diefenbaker to New Brunswick and, of course, St. John, because he handled publicity and promotions. I recall he told a story about cooking breakfast himself for Diefenbaker when he stayed at the Admiral Beatty Hotel. He was great lifelong friends with Conservative Member of Parliament Tom Bell. He took many trips to Parliament in Ottawa to visit Tom when we lived in Montreal. And I think that's the end of this walk along Elliot Row. So I'm hoping after I finish a couple of things that you'll all stay online and share your comments and memories and suggestions. Anything you can remember about Elliott Street will just make this walk that much better. And no doubt I've missed a family somewhere along the way. And just to keep you up to speed on the Wednesday Walk series, we've gotten through the first 4, so Orange Street, King Street East, Leinster Street, and Elliot Row. I have recordings for all of these. And once I clean them up, they will be posted. We're going to take a break next week. In New Brunswick, it's March break week. I had some other plans which have since fallen through, but a little extra writing time will come in handy to do the next 4 walks. The next 3 walks will be set in the cemetery, and we'll visit the graves of the Jewish war veterans, the Jewish merchants of Main Street, and then we'll look at some of the people whose lives were cut short by murder, illness, and accident. And then we'll take another break to get through Passover. And the final walk will be on Summer Street on April the 19th. And that one will be completely freshly written, and I'm sure any contributions that people can make will be immensely appreciated. And finally, just my reminder that if you have bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah stories to share, whether you were the person having the bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, or you were the person who made the cookies or decorated the shul, or even if you were just on the guest list and turned up for all of the events, I'd love to have your stories to fill out the exhibit. So if you have memories, if you have a drawer of invitations tucked away, old photographs, assorted kippas in your drawer. I have lots, you can always have a few more, or anything else that you have as memorabilia for the exhibit. We would love to have it so that we can really make that exhibit successful.